When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you."
Welcome to the Bible Feed podcast, a place for conversations about the Bible and faith in the modern world, where ordinary people come together to help each other understand the Bible better. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, welcome to the Bible Feed podcast. My name's Josh and thanks for joining us this Easter 2021. And we are still talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Why is it still so important to Christians? Why can't we let it go? Why do we think about it? Why do we remember it? Why do we celebrate it? Whether you're a Christian or you're interested in learning a bit more about the Christadelphian view of the resurrection and some historical evidence for it, some reasons why it's important to Christians, well, you've come to the right place. I've got Nathan with me. Hi Nathan, how are you?
Hello everyone, I'm fine, thank you. All good here.
Excellent. We've also got Nathan's dog in the background, so we might have a special guest coming on a bit later. You might hear from Martha, which will be quite exciting as well. But what we're going to be talking about is reasons for being interested and thinking that the resurrection really happened, looking at some historical evidence, and then also secondly thinking about why it's important to Christians. Even if it's something that has some historical validity and interest, what's the fuel, what's driving the interest in this specific event? So to start us off, Nathan, let's think about reasons for belief, not in abstract, but we're going to consider some historical data, but surely also we have to address the fact that we're looking at something that's quite an extraordinary claim that somebody arose from the dead, right?
I agree. And I think, well, we're going to have a look at some of the evidence that I find persuasive to show that Jesus did in fact rise from the dead. However, if you don't believe in God, if you say there is no God and there is no possibility of God, then anything is going to be more plausible than the resurrection, because it is an event that requires the laws of nature to be broken.
Right.
And if there is no God, it's not possible. So I suppose I proceed on the basis that there are perhaps other reasons that you might think there's at least a possibility that there is a God. And if there is a God, or if there is a possibility there's a God, then I find the resurrection, as we'll see, the best explanation for what happened.
So we're adding those two things together, I suppose. We're going to look at some historical evidence and we're going to add it to this probability that that God exists. And if we do so, then it's reasonable, isn't it? And then it's rational and it makes sense to approach the resurrection as something that could have happened and be interested in learning about it and thinking about it more closely.
I think that's very fair.
Excellent. The other point I'd just like to make quickly before we dive in is that we are hoping to demonstrate some things that are interesting and some things that are useful when thinking about these subjects, but also admit that, were we presented with new evidence, if it could be shown, or that the existing evidence, the data and the stuff that we're going to look at, if that was shown to be false in some sort of way, that we would hope that we would have, the intellectual honesty to reevaluate these conclusions that we have arrived at. So with that out of the way, let's get straight in. Let's think about some reasons to believe, and think about a bit of the historical evidence and what we're presented with. What do you want us to look at first?
Sure. So I think the claim of the resurrection is based on two key points. On the concept that there was an empty tomb, and on the concept that people claim to have seen Jesus after he had been raised from the dead.
Okay.
If you can support those two claims, then I think you have a pretty robust case for believing that Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead. So empty tomb, resurrection appearances, then I think if you can show that there is good data, good evidence for those points, then I think you're well on the road to thinking, yeah, Jesus probably did rise from the dead.
Okay, so the second point, I guess, makes sense for us in a historical perspective, because if people were looking for Jesus to rise from the dead, or if indeed they thought that it had happened, even if they were mistaken, it's obviously something that they probably would be happy telling other people about. But about that first point, the empty tomb, why is that important? What does that sort of help us to understand or believe in relation to this?
So I think we've got to put ourselves back into the context of the first century.
Okay.
You're going back to 30-ish AD, and you got a bunch of Jews going around and telling people in Jerusalem that, hey, this guy Jesus, yes, he was crucified, but he's risen and we've seen him. And the first people they were preaching to were Jewish. They were the people who had put Jesus to death. If those Jews could show that there was in fact a body, that the tomb wasn't empty, or show some evidence to the contrary, I think we would likely see that. I think it's a reasonable expectation. And the fact that these people were able to preach about Jesus in the very place he had died, I think tells us something about the nature of the claim that they're making.
Right. So it could easily have been contested, right? Because they're in the exact same city and surroundings of where the events happened. So it is hard enough, trying to work out what happens on the other side of the world these days with the communication and the abilities that we have with technology. But this all happens in the same localized area, and it's also a claim that they're making about something that happened, not a long period of time ago. It's not some way back when thing that is sort of newly being brought about. It's the local headlines, if you like. So there's no time period involved that's too expansive, right? From when we start seeing these claims being made. Absolutely,
and I think that is probably one of the most important points when we're thinking about the evidence for the resurrection. So I made 2 points about the empty tomb and about there being post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. And I think both of those, but particularly the idea that people saw Jesus after his death, is incredibly well supported by evidence that is as close as one can ever expect in the ancient context to the date that those events were supposed to have taken place. I wonder if maybe I can just read to everyone from 1 Corinthians 15, because I think that this is a really significant point in the context of thinking about the resurrection. So this is Paul, one of the foremost individuals within that early church, and this is what he says to some early believers: that I passed to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and it was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And what's significant is, Paul is writing this, it's generally accepted in the 50s AD. So we're not very far on from the supposed resurrection anyway.
Okay.
But he says, I pass on to you as of first importance what I also received, and this is a kind of a standard formula for saying It's not something I'm making up now, but this is something I've actually received from other people. And when I came to see you guys, I pass this on to you. So this formula that we find in Paul's letter is something that must go back earlier than his letter, earlier than his visits to Corinth. And I think that takes us pretty close. Some claim to the 30s AD, but it at least takes you very close to the date of the supposed resurrection. And that's quite remarkable in this kind of context, that we've got this claim to these pretty remarkable events in close proximity to when they were supposed to have happened.
That's really good, because not only is Paul sort of saying this is something I've already told you before, so it clearly predates the writing of the letter. He's implying that he said this or something along these lines out loud to them when he was there previously, but also he's saying that it was, even before I got it then, it was something that had been given to me from previous. So it's establishing, a greater distance back in time, closer to the events themselves. I suppose we should just pause for a second to note that this is Paul, who had been Saul of Tarsus. This is a man whose life is turned around, and going from a position of persecuting the church, of being very anti this idea of Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah, as a key figure in God's plan for the world, is turned around by the vision that he sees, and instead of persecuting the church, decides to instead join and become this teacher, this preacher, this apostle, this integral member of the community that he had previously sought to disband and stamp out. So it was a pervasive and persuasive set of occurrences that turned this person's life around. We have other examples. So James, the brother of Jesus, is another person who becomes an important figure in the church after previously, it seems, sort of disagreeing with the message and the intent and the actions of Jesus whilst he was alive. So there are also people who you would expect not to believe and continue not to believe, who change their minds because of what is reported by other Christians and events in their own lives as well.
And I think in both in the case of both Paul and James, we've got pretty good historical data that says, yes, these people didn't believe what Jesus was saying previously, or they were hostile to the Christian way and against Christianity being preached, certainly in the case of Paul. And the fact that you have this big turnaround is all the more remarkable when you put it in that context. You kind of say, well, there must be something going on. There must be something happening for them that's enabled them to take this complete 180 from persecution to go and preaching Jesus everywhere they possibly can, and even where they're not supposed to.
So if there is, if we're seeing these changes, these about turns, these 180s, as you put it, you're right. We have to assume that something is causing this, right? We're seeing all these different bits of evidence that need some sort of explanation, and that is as a whole, as we consider the possibilities and the claims that are being made. If the resurrection did happen, well, it would explain the data that we're seeing. Then the pattern of things that happen after the resurrection add up and make sense. We would expect the people to go out and start preaching and telling everyone about this amazing news. And if it really did happen, and people were convinced, then maybe they had to perform this 180 in what they were thinking. Okay, are there any other points that you want to make about sort of historical evidence or other things that we could look at that, again, need some sort of explanation, and the resurrection may well be the best way to explain it?
Yeah, I think a connected with this idea. We referenced Paul and James. We know they were both coming from a Jewish context. They were followers of that way of life. And suddenly they go and do something completely different. And there's a number of these cultural changes that we see following the supposed resurrection of Jesus. So just to give you a few examples, we suddenly go from the Sabbath on the Saturday being the most significant day through to suddenly we're choosing Sunday as our key day, as what's known as the first day when Jesus rose from the dead. We've got a movement from only Jews being accepted through to everyone, Jews and non-Jews, being welcomed into this new faith. We've got a change in the kind of the rites associated with the faith. So in the Jewish context, you had circumcision. That was the rite of passage for people who were born into Jewish families. And now we've got baptism in Christianity. We go from a temple to people meeting anywhere they like. And I think all these things, they're quite significant changes in a very short space of time. And again, it kind of leads us to say, well, so how did that happen? What's the best explanation for that? So I think those are also pretty significant points.
Yeah, because they're all sort of uphill changes that you would struggle to sort of pass through these reform changes in the way that many people had been practicing and demonstrating and participating in their religious communities and sort of demonstrating their beliefs and their faith. And some of them, like the day change, for example, if Jesus hadn't risen, would it really be necessary to make everyone up sticks and move their calendar day of observation from what had been established on the Sabbath, and people swathes of their ancestors and their fathers and their grandmothers had all been observing and meeting for prayer and readings and all these things on one day of the week, to then force this unnatural and ostensibly unnecessary change, had there not been a particularly good reason that everyone was going to be broadly on board with, it would need something quite seismic, something massively forceful and weighty to affect this kind of change. And again, to give up and to move away from things like temple worship, things that could be that would have been adhered to and would have made sense for so many people for so long. There must be something driving this change. There must be something informing these differences that people became so insistent on that they had to change and form the community that they were in around these changes. And again, this is more stuff that's saying, well, what's causing this current? What's pushing all these things in this direction? Even if they're going against the traditional flow, even if they're going to cause problems and some divisions and some complexity and more questions to answer, there's got to be something with a certain amount of force, something with a certain amount of drive behind it.
And I guess my answer to that is, well, yeah, Jesus actually, he really did rise from the dead, and that's my answer to why all these things happened. That's my answer to the evidence that we've got. So we've got various competing hypotheses as to what happened to cause all these things, which I don't think we're going to talk about now.
Sure.
But for me, if there is a God, if it's plausible, if it's possible that there is a God, then the resurrection is the best explanation for all these things. And I feel anything else feels very ad hoc.
Okay.
Nothing quite hangs together in the way that the explanation of an actual resurrection, which is the claim of these people, of these first Christians. That's what makes most sense to me.
Okay, so that's the central claim. We'd love to hear in the comments or on the Bible Feed website if you think there is another event or another series of events or pattern of events or a way to explain all of these changes that works better for you than the resurrection of Jesus. It'd be interesting to enter into a dialogue about an alternative theory that we might need to consider. Okay, great. So that's the first half, we've looked at some historical reasons to believe, or at the very least be interested in, and have to come up with some sort of answer as to why we see these changes, why we see the evidence that we have provided for us. Before we move on to the reasons that it's important, Nathan, are there any other points you want to make that sort of broadly lie under that first category?
I think we'll pause there. I think my only point to say would be, we've just tried to capture pretty briefly some high level points. As you would expect, there are all manner of other bits of data we could look at, and there are also counterpoints to these bits of data. And it's important that people understand that actually, okay, I think there is really good evidence, for example, that Paul was someone who went and persecuted the first Christians and changed his mind. And I think that's pretty well accepted. But across all these points, there are counterpoints. And I think we've tried to say, well, these are pretty well attested bits of history, but they're not without dispute. And I think probably at the end, you'll probably recommend a few different resources that allow you to go and explore that and investigate that a bit further.
Okay, excellent. Well, let's move now to our second section. We'll think about the reasons why the resurrection is important, why Christians are still so focused on it, because for believers, there is more than just sort of acquiescing and being interested by the historical evidence, by seeing that others believed it early on and seeing that they made changes that stemmed from the claim of a resurrected Jesus. Okay, so we've been thinking about evidence, historical evidence, what we see the early Christians talking about as what they understood and what they believed to have happened. And we're going to now think about why those Christians, and indeed Christians today, people who follow Jesus, still think that the resurrection is important, what effect it sort of has. So to introduce that to us, Nathan, how do we sort of link up these two parts together, the history and then the sort of the application stuff today?
So I think the claim of the resurrection, if we can get behind that, if we're persuaded by that, then as that kind of reframes our whole narrative of history, this is God entering the world to completely change what's happening, because the sort of the message of the resurrection that these first Christians go and talk about isn't just, there was this prophet and he was a really good person and he just happened to kind of be resurrected, and that's the end of the story. Mm-hmm. There's a sort of a massive raft of implications that they take from this, and that includes the fact that the risen Jesus should change the lives of people. It should influence the lives of people who follow him, and ultimately that this man Jesus, he's going to come back to earth again. He's going to change the world. He's going to bring renewal, and a new creation is the language that's used. And so if we accept this claim of the resurrection, then I think it's reasonable that these massive implications that these first Christians said would happen in the future, that we should kind of take those things seriously, and we should look to try and understand that and see what effect that has 2,000 years later. Does that seem fair?
Absolutely, because yes, yeah. When we look at the way the resurrection is talked about, when Paul describes it, when it's described in the gospel records, and the output that we see from early Christians is it's not treated as a sort of a spiritualized parable story meant to briefly encourage people to good works, but nothing more. It's not presented as something that happens on outside of space and time or anything like that, and it's merely just something to be a sort of a gentle encouragement or something along those lines. Instead, it's presented as this incredibly realistic, incredibly brutal and gory and difficult and challenging story as well. that nevertheless is rooted in history, and so therefore, as you say, impacts the people there clearly very very powerfully, but then also continues to exert that same power on Christians throughout history. It links up with sort of promises made, and links up with the things that Jesus talked about, and the understanding of who he was and what he was doing, and what people following him were doing as well. So absolutely, yes, I think that that absolutely tracks and makes sense. Okay, so because it's a big and it's a bold major claim that puts Christianity in the historical category, not purely in a spiritualized sort of thing. Are there any other things that we sort of see Christians doing, or we see Christians believing because of the resurrection? What sort of effect does it have on them? You talked about sort of future hope and things like that. Are there any other things that we could think about that we see Christians doing or believing because of their belief in the resurrection?
So I think the main claim that they make is that this man Jesus, because he was raised from the dead, you were separated from God, particularly if you were Jewish. You had this gap, you had this chasm between man and between God. And what Jesus has done, he's closed that gap. He's brought us back to God, and that is, I would suggest, the fundamental, the most important thing that these Christians say, that the resurrection of the death and the resurrection of Jesus brings us back to God. And if he brings us back to God, then that can completely change your way of life. It changes how you want to respond to the world around you. And that's what they go on to do. That's how they go on to interact with the world in a completely different way. And then ultimately say, well, we might be able to do this in the world now. We might be able to change the way things happen on a small scale in our own lives, in the lives of our community. But ultimately, we're looking for something bigger, something more complete. And I think that's probably the second key message that came from it. And they tried to show that Jesus was going to come back to bring a renewal.
It is a major point, isn't it? Because that's what we see in practice as well. They are emboldened and empowered, and go from this band of demoralized followers who have just lost their leader, and the years that they had spent sort of following him, listening to his teaching, seems to be undone because he's been crushed under the Roman Empire, the political and religious authorities of the day, and he is no more, and there's no leader sort of standing up to sort things out and bring the things that they had hoped for about. And yet history shows us that instead of just staying this sort of group of disparate people who you would expect to just disperse and perhaps be mentioned in some old annals and things like that, but don't amount to very much. Instead, we see the creation and the momentum building on what becomes the most diverse, the most multi-ethnic and multicultural movement that the earth has ever known. And the power of the resurrection is what is fueling that. Because for the early Christians, it isn't just a historical event. They find energy, they find utility, they find power in its compelling message. And so Jesus, for Christians, ratified and demonstrated in the resurrection, is more than just a teacher. He's more than just a popular figure who leads and at times, as you say, causes us to think our reactions and might want to reorient our lives a little bit through his nice teaching. But instead, in the first century, we see these groups of people who have come to believe that this man was resurrected from the dead, and that forms communities. That sort of builds groups of people who are, divided in their societies by age, by race, and by sex, and by employment status, and all those kind of things. And instead, this man who was just from a small unimportant hamlet in the north of Israel, and his message where he sort of speaks up for the poor and the oppressed and the people who are sick and needy, and rails against the powers that put them there, and rails against the people that ignore them, this group of people is empowered, is emboldened, is energized by what they believe about the resurrection. And so I think that goes quite some way for me personally as to why Christians still keep talking about the resurrection, why they still keep thinking about it, because it demonstrates that if you believe in a God, and if you believe that God caused the resurrection to happen, we see God on the side of someone who was killed wrongly, and he is raised back to life because of what he said and because of what he did, and because he is so vital and so important and energizing and useful and instructional and all these things, that he must be brought back from the life, and that people who believe in these things that have happened and associate themselves with them and align and reorient their lives around it can participate. They can be part of what they have come to believe and understand was going on in the resurrection. And so we see, the God of all creation on the side of this murdered man, who is willing and able to raise him back to life from the dead, and that is extended to those who choose to follow him in their lives as well.
And when we think about what happened to a lot of those first followers who went about preaching that message, who went saying, this is what's happened, this is how it's changed my life, they ended up in some pretty sticky situations and ultimately paying the price with their life. And I think that just gives us an extra, I think it probably tells us something about the nature of the claims, but also about how it really did change and inspire a different way of life from these people, to the extent that they were happy to go to their graves saying, this Jesus, he rose from the dead, and I'm not going to change my mind no matter what you do to me.
Yes, it means so much to me that I'm very literally willing to die on this hill. Yeah, having skin in the game. I think hopefully we've demonstrated some reasons, historical reasons for why you should be interested in this subject, and hopefully also a bit of understanding and a bit of context as to why Christians think it's so important. Nathan, I've really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you very much for coming on the Bible Feed podcast.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, happy Easter, everyone. We'd love to hear from you if there are any other reasons. For example, if you are a believer, that other things we might not have mentioned that you find compelling and interesting as to reasons for belief in the resurrection of Jesus, or indeed things that it inspires and motivates and sort of brings up in your mind and your life. And also, indeed, if there are other ways to understand the evidence that some of the evidence that we've looked at this evening, we would love to hear from you about that. Stay safe, everyone. Keep washing your hands. Keep washing your hands, Nathan. And hopefully we'll be able to do some more of these events in person in the future. But that said, thank you very much for being with here and being with us here. And good evening.
Been listening to the Bible Feed podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're always keen to hear what you think, hear your questions or subjects you'd like to discuss. So get in touch with us on our Facebook page or send a message from our webpage at biblefeed.org and be part of the journey.